Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and we're starting to get toward the end of our player progression system. At this point, we've added lots of great visuals so that we can see healing and damage effects, and we've also created a menu that has attributes that affect specific stats. That said, none of those stats currently affect gameplay realities. So in this video, we're going to create a player stats controller that's going to link all of those stats to things like our max health, our attack damage, and spell power. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Alright, so first up, I'm just going to head into my bootstrap scene, which is where I've got my player as well as my player progression menus. I'm then just going to turn the canvas group to 1 so that we can actually see it. In the final video, we will do some cleanup and polish, including a toggle and mini menu so that you can move between things like your minimap and stats menus, but that's coming up. Okay, let's head into our player progression menu. And what we want to do here is separate out our concerns. We currently have a progression manager, which handles things like updating our UI and also taking in the button presses when we want to add points. We could try and stuff into here all of our player stats hookups as well, but this would quickly become a bloated script. And so we're going to separate out our concerns by adding a player stats controller. The only thing we're going to do in the progression manager in order to make that work is create an event. This is going to be a public event action, and we're just going to call it onStatsChanged so that anytime our stats are actually changed, it sends out a message to notify the controller. This is going to happen down by our confirm button, as that's the only place where the stats are officially actually changed. With that event created, we can go back into Unity and create our new monobehavior script, and we'll call this one PlayerStatsController. Once we get inside of here, we can begin by getting rid of our update method. We will be using start, so I'll keep that there. Now we are going to need to link this script to our progression manager so that it can access some of the information there. And so let's make a header here for references to player components, as there will be a few of them. And then we'll make a public progression manager reference called progression manager. So first off, whenever the game starts, we are going to want to apply all of our stats to the different things that need to know about them. So let's call a new apply all stats method, and then we'll go ahead and create a private void method to do just that. Here I'm just going to begin by putting notes so we can see all the work we're going to be doing in this video. We'll be applying changes to health, to combat, and to magic. For now though, we just want to test to make sure this is working. So let's make a debug log here that just lets us know we've called the apply all stats method. Finally, along with calling this in the start method, we also want to make sure that it's called anytime our stats actually change. So in our onEnable, so as soon as this script gets enabled, we'll just go to our progression manager and subscribe to the onStatsChanged event that we just created. And whenever that event goes out, we're going to want to call this apply all stats method. We also want to make sure to unsubscribe in onDisable. Back in Unity then, we're going to click on our player, and we're just going to add the component for our player stats controller, and it's just going to need a reference to our progression manager, so let's drag that in there. Now, when we hit play, as soon as the game starts, we'll see that our debug console is printing that we've called apply all stats. Now we can add some points, and nothing will happen at first. However, when we hit confirm, there we go, the message is being printed again. All right, looks like things are working so far. Let's actually hook this up to some in-game stuff now. Now there's two main models for how to handle this system that we're creating, a push and a pull model. The pull model is where each individual component that needs to get our stats data simply has a reference to the player stats controller and pulls the stats data whenever it needs it. This can work. That said, I don't like the fact that there's a whole bunch of different scripts reaching into this, and it can sometimes be hard to debug. So we're going to be using a push method instead, where we have one centralized script, the stats controller, which holds a reference to all the different components that need its data, and it just pushes that data out whenever a change happens. So we're going to start by heading to our apply all stats, and let's begin with health. So first of all, anytime the stats change, we want to apply the change to our health stats. Let's come down below and create that apply health stats method. Now anytime this method is called, we will need to talk to our health script. So let's come up top and make a public health reference called health. At this point then, we want to actually talk to our health script and push the new information to it. Now if you take a look in health, you'll notice that we do have this integer for max health here. And the simplest way to do this would just be to directly modify it from our stats controller. That said, that's not really best practice, and health is actually a good case to show you why. So let's pop down to the bottom here below where we update our health and change health, and we're going to create a new public method called change max health. This one will take in an integer for the new max health amount. Now we'll start here by taking our max health and actually just setting it to the new max health amount. And at this point you might be saying, then why didn't we just directly reach in and change it? Why create a whole method? And the fact is that we want to have the opportunity to do more than just change max health. For example, whenever we change our max health, what happens to our current health? We have a couple of options. One, we could just set it to full. That said, I want to just do something a little more common in games, which is where if our max health has gone up by 50, our regular health will also go up by 50. To do this, we need to actually calculate the difference, so we'll make an integer for that, between our new max health and the max health before the change came along. Now that we know the difference between our old max health and the new one, I'm actually going to go to max health and I'm going to add the difference. This will accomplish the exact same thing as directly setting it to max health. However, I'm also going to use the difference to change our health. So we'll call the change health method we already have, pass along the difference so that if our max health has gone up by 5, now our regular health will also increase by 5. And for my code, I need to pass along a vector to 0 to show that I want no knockback. At this point, we can actually get rid of our start method altogether because this script won't have to handle its own initialization anymore, as now our PlayerStatsController will tell it when to initialize. So when that initial message gets sent out from the stats controller, change health will be called, which will update all of our health stuff. The only problem is that whenever change health is called, we get a health pop-up. And at the start of the game, you probably don't want a pop-up appearing showing your player going to full health. So all we want to do is add a little gate in here so that we have the opportunity to limit whether or not the pop-up happens. So here we'll come into change health and we're going to add an optional overload. So for the last one, we'll have a bool called show pop-up, and we'll set it to true by default, meaning we generally want to show it. Now to make this gate actually do something, we'll come down here to where we already checked to see if we have a health pop-up, and we'll just add another condition, and that is that show pop-up is true. Or for short, you can just say and show pop-up. They mean the same thing. Now, only if that value is true will we actually get a pop-up. We can then come down below here and just make sure that anytime we're calling this method, because our max health changed, that we call false on the regular health pop-up. All right, with all of that set up, let's go back to our stats controller, and we can now finish this call here to talk to our health script. So whenever we go to apply a health stats change, we want to make sure that our health script knows to change max health, and we want to pass along our max health stat. We can access this by going to stats.maxHealth. That said, at this point, it won't know which version of max health to show. If we take a look in the progression manager, you'll remember that we have both base attributes and preview attributes. The base ones being sort of the real finalized stats, and the preview being the ones we're trying out when we add in attribute points. So it's the base one that we're going to want here. We want to pass along our actual final max health value. So then in our stats controller, we can actually add an attributes reference called base attributes. We're going to make this one a property, so we'll give it a capital B. And here, anytime we ask for a base attribute value, we're just going to tell it that we want it to look inside the progression manager and grab our base attributes, not the preview ones. So then, whenever we call apply health stats, we want to change health and pass along the stats.maxHealth, and then in brackets just put base attributes so that it knows which version of max health to send along. Back in Unity now, let's go to our player, and in the stats controller, it's going to want a health reference. We've been putting all of these components on our sprite, so we'll drag the sprite right in there. With that done, we're about ready to test, but let's just go to player progression, and I'm just going to zero out my canvas group here so that it's not displaying on screen as soon as I open the level. I'm then going to open up room 1, and just a reminder, in the next video we will add an in-game toggle for this menu so we don't have to keep doing this manually. Now then, as soon as I get in the game, my max health does in fact change, though we don't get that pop-up showing up. And if I were to go ahead and turn on the progression menu here, we could go in and add a bunch of vitality, and then you'll notice that as soon as I hit confirm, my max health went up and my health also went up proportionally. All right, that's working nicely. Let's try applying this to combat now. Now, if we pop into PlayerStatsController, we can make a reference to combat, similar to what we did to health. And before we write that, let's just pop into our combat script. Now in the past, we just had a set integer for damage, and then down below here when we did an attack, we passed along a negative version of that so that the enemy's health would be changed by that amount. Now we want to make sure that we're using stats here instead. So we'll keep the damage value there, though we'll be changing it based on what our stats say in a moment. But while we're here, let's also add a public float for our crit chance, as we did create a crit chance stat earlier in the series. Now you may remember that crit chance was a little different. I wanted to show how you could use a float instead of an integer. So we made this one a float that's out of a total of 1. So as we're doing our math, just keep in mind that 1 is kind of our max for crit chance. So down in our attack method then, instead of just applying a straight negative damage value to our enemy, we want to calculate whether or not a crit has happened. So here we're going to make a new integer for real damage, and it will start off being equal to damage. So if there's no crit, we'll just deal the normal damage amount. That said, here we'll introduce an if statement. We're going to roll a random dot value. This just returns a number somewhere between 0 and 1, so it works perfect with our crit chance, which was 0.05. So now, if that random value is less than our crit chance, in our case meaning there's a 1 in 20 chance of a crit happening, then we'll want to change our real damage amount. In our case, we'll take the real damage we just set and multiply it by a crit multiplier. Now if you want, you could create a separate stat for this and add it, but I'm going to keep things simple and just make it so that any crit is just 1.5 times a normal attack. Now you'll notice that I'm getting an error here, and that's just because our real damage is an integer, but currently with this crit multiplier, we're going to be returning a float. So we just want to add a math function that whatever value we get here, we'll have to round it to the nearest integer. All right, with that done, we've now added the ability to have a crit chance and to add a crit multiplier, but we still need to hook this up to our stats. So back in our PlayerStatsController, let's call apply combat stats, and then create a new private void method to do just that. Now, as with our health script, the simplest and most easy way to do this would just be to tell our combat script to change its damage value to equal our stats for attack damage, and to do the same with crit chance. That said, this does pose some potential problems down the road if we're just reaching in and directly modifying stats. Additionally, it robs us of the ability to have special things happen when a stat changes, like having different visuals appear or buff icons or things like that. And so I'm going to do this the right way, and so I'll just head into combat, and first of all, I'm going to take the damage and crit chance, anything that comes from a stat, and make these private so they can't be directly modified. We'll then come down below, and here we can make a public void method to set our stats, and for now this will just take in an int for damage and a float for our crit chance. You could separate these out into their own methods if you want to have special handling, but for our case this will work just fine. At this point, we can just take this damage, the one from this script, and set it equal to the damage passed in, and then we can do the exact same thing for our crit chance. Now I realize for a simple script like this, we haven't actually accomplished much different from just directly setting them from the stats controller. That said, we've added a layer of protection by making them private, and set things up so that later on we could add additional logic around a stat change if we want to. Now then, in the stats controller, we can simplify this by just calling combat set stats and then pass along the two stat values that we want to. Now in apply stats, I'm just going to get rid of this debug log as we don't need it anymore, and we're ready to do another test. Back in Unity now, I'm just going to drag my bootstrap scene up alongside my room so that I can see them both at the same time, and on player, I want to make sure that we have a combat reference, which once again is on his sprite. I can then remove the bootstrap from here, and then I just want to take a second. Currently my enemy doesn't have much health, and so it's going to be hard to test as he'll die right away. So I'm just going to click on him and give him lots of health so we can do lots of attacks to test things. All right, so when we first get in, you can see that I'm dealing 30 damage, and then we've got the 45 occasionally to show there's a crit. Give him a bunch of extra attack damage by adding some stats here. We'll apply those changes, and yes, I have to manually close the menu. You can see that we're now dealing 57 for a crit and 38 on regular. So those changes have worked nicely. All right, all that remains now is to do the same thing for our spell power, which is going to get a little more complex. Now the reason this one's going to be a little more complex is that our magic script doesn't currently have a concept of spell power. Instead, it just calls cast spell, which talks to the current spell scriptable object and just tells it to do its thing. If we look at the spell SO, you can see that it doesn't have any sort of spell power ever, but we have to go into the specific spells to see how much damage or healing they are designed to do. So what we're going to want to do is map a spell power on top of this that works as a sort of modifier, taking that base amount and then altering it so that it's more powerful if we have more spell power. Now first off, I'm just going to go into my stats, and currently we created something called spell damage. That said, since we're going to be using this for healing, it does make more sense to call it something like spell power. In my ID, I can use Command R to replace all versions of it, which is really nice and easy. That said, if yours doesn't do that, you might have to just use your console to debug the changes and find any places that messed up, or you can just leave the name with the current convention, which really isn't that big of a deal. Now then, let's go into our PlayerStatsController, and we can at last do this apply magic stats call, and we'll want to come up top and make sure that we have a reference to our magic script. We can then scroll down and make sure that we have a method for this to call. This will be a private void apply magic stats. Right off the bat here, we could talk to our magic script, and we're essentially going to do the exact same thing we did with combat, where we call a new setStats method and then pass along the stat, in this case spell power, that we want to modify. In our magic script then, we'll actually want to create a concept of spell power, so let's make a private int for that. And then down below here, we'll make that helper method, this one will be public, called setStats, that's going to take in an integer for the new spell power value. We'll then just make sure that any time this is called, it sets this script's spell power to be equal to the one that was just passed in. The only other change to make here is that whenever we call cast, we want to make sure that we pass that value along to our scriptable object. Now, since our spell SO doesn't actually do the calculations itself, it's just going to be a middleman that also forwards that spell power information on to the spell. And now if we go to heal spell, you'll notice, first of all, it's giving us an error. So let's come up to our method signature here and make sure that we give it an overload so that it can actually take in an integer for spell power. Now here we're going to do something similar to what we did in combat, where we calculated the real damage amount instead of just using a flat amount. And there's two ways to do this. The simplest would be to make an int for real heal, which just takes the heal amount, in our case 10, and adds your spell power as a straight number. So if you have 5 spell power, your heal amount will go up by 5. That said, I want to show how to do this slightly more complex and kind of more the way that real games do this. So we'll have a float, which will be our spell modifier. This will start off as 1, so that if we have 0 spell power, we'll still deal that base amount of 10. That said, we are going to add to our spell modifier our spell power divided by 20. Now the reason I'm using 20 here is because 20 is my max amount. So at max, this would equal 20 divided by 20, which is 1, which would essentially double the power of this spell. Now then, when we calculate our real heal, I'll just take that heal amount and multiply it by that spell modifier. Now again, this won't like this at first because that's going to create a float, so we'll make sure that we use a math function and round it to an integer. Finally then, when we call change health, we want to make sure that we pass along the real heal value and not just the base amount. All right. We've now added this for healing. Let's do the same thing for combat. Now if we head into our spark spell, it also needs to take in that extra overload for spell power. And once again, we'll make a float for our spell modifier, which will start at 1, but we'll add to it our spell power divided by whatever your max is, in my case 20. Then we'll calculate the real damage, an integer this time, and we'll be rounding to int. But again, here we'll take that base damage value from the top of the script and just multiply it by our spell modifier. We then just have to make sure that we do pass in a negative version of that real damage so that the damage gets applied. Now back in Unity, you'll probably be getting an error at this point from your teleport script. And personally, I don't really want spell power to affect this, simply because if I change the range too much, it's going to affect gameplay in weird ways, and I might be teleporting into walls or just having strange things happen. And so I just want to get rid of the error. So I'll do this by adding the overload for spell power, but then we're just not going to use it. Back in Unity, that should take care of all of our errors. We can go ahead and drag our bootstrap in here. Let's click on our player and just make sure that we have a reference to our magic script, which again is on our sprite. I'll then just remove the bootstrap and load up our scene. Here now, when I get in the game, if I collect a spell, it's currently dealing 10 damage, which looks about right, and I'm currently healing for 14. That said, if I click on player progression, open up the menu and give us a little extra spell power, you'll notice here that my words still say spell damage. We'll fix that in a second. Confirm those changes and then go ahead and close the menu once more. If I get close enough to deal damage, it's now dealing 14, and my heal has also buffed a little bit up to 15. All right, that's working pretty nicely. Let's fix that UI issue. Now this fix is purely UI, and if we open up our player progression, go into the stats menu and go to our stats slot specifically, you can see here that we have a display name box. We're just going to want to make sure to change that so that it no longer says spell damage, but is spell power. Now then, when we get in the game, everything should be working just fine. We can deal our damage, we can heal ourselves. When we open up our menu, we have the correct number there. And when we change the values, we are in fact giving ourselves more spell power. All right, I hope this one's given you enough examples so that you can apply stats to whatever you need to in your game. In the next video, we'll do just a little bit of polish, make sure that we have a way to toggle this menu in-game, and also add sort of a mini menu so that we can go between mini-map, stats menu, and whatever else we may create down the road. Hope to see you in that final video. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.